Okay, let's talk Louisiana Purchase. A momentous occasion in American history for sure. The Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the United States. And this is how it came about. Last, we talked about the land west of the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains was all territory that was owned by the Spanish when the French handed it over to them in support for uh, or for the Spanish support in the uh, 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. At a certain point, it changed hands again, and it reverted back to France in a secret deal between Napoleon and the Spanish. So France was now in control of all this territory over here, known as, well, in the future becomes the Louisiana Purchase. Here's the Mississippi River right here. There was a treaty that allowed the United States to use the port of New Orleans, and that was called Pinckney's Treaty, if you remember us going over last chapter. Negotiated treaty between the United States and Spain that would keep that port open, so vital as people in the United States who were now living in Ohio and in the Indiana territory here. They'd move here, they'd float their crops down the Ohio River, which goes right down where my cursor is going, to the Mississippi River, to New Orleans here on an ocean-going vessel, and then they'd take it to the markets in the east. So that's how they would get their crops to market. Much easier than, say, putting it on a cart where you can't fit that much and then going over the Appalachian Mountains. It just wasn't doable financially. This was. So now that the Mississippi River was open after the Pinckney's Treaty, the Americans felt good about that. Well, then they found out that this territory now was owned by France, and France is much more powerful than Spain. And the fact that France was a rival really scared many Americans, and they thought, uh-oh, here we go again. The Mississippi River is going to be off limits to the Americans because the French would probably not allow them to use it. So President Jefferson sent a messenger over, well, actually a couple, sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to negotiate some kind of Pinckney-like treaty with the French that would replace the one that they had with the Spanish. So he gave them permission to spend up to $10 million for the purchase of New Orleans, right? Just straight up New Orleans, and just the city of New Orleans, so they would never have to worry about any kind of treaty again. Jefferson would really like to purchase that city. Well, they get there, and much to their surprise, Napoleon said, before they could even give them the offer of $10 million, Napoleon said, I will give you all of Louisiana, which is all this brown area here, for a sum of $15 million. And they couldn't believe that he was willing to do that. One, why would he want to do that? He had just taken that from the Spanish. What's his purpose for that? But they didn't care. They shook his hand and said, we'll take the deal. Well, they really had no right to do that. They didn't have permission to spend up to $15 million, but they said, hey, we don't want him to change his mind. So they shook his hand anyway. Any treaty that is signed has to go through the Senate to get approval. So this is not over yet, as this treaty of the Louisiana Purchase and the $15 million had to go to the president, and he had to approve it, and the Senate had to approve it. And one thing about Jefferson is that he was always about frugality, meaning he didn't want to spend money. He wanted to, cut the budget and do those kind of things. And this would $15 million, although seems like not that very much money, because you've got houses in Pebble Beach that are worth $15 million today. All this territory was like pennies on the acre. But at the time, $15 million was twice as much as the United States took in taxes in an entire year. So it was a massive sum of money. And Jefferson, when he heard about this, was really kind of uncomfortable about spending that much money. And he said, and about Jefferson is that one thing is that he is a strict interpreter of the Constitution. and the Constitution doesn't say anything about expanding land, expanding the United States. So once again, his old conservatism in that realm kicked in, and he said, I don't know. So he was really apprehensive. On the flip side for Jefferson is the purchase of all this land would create a lot of farmland. And he wanted the United States to remain agrarian, meaning farm-based. And that was the thing for the Democrat-Republican Party, is they didn't want the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to remain farm-based. This would give opportunities for people to move out there and start farming. So you had a big debate within Jefferson's own mind, right? Because remember, we talk about him being consistently inconsistent. And you also had people in the United States that say, why would we want to take over all this territory? Because it's nothing more than a desert out there. We know it's not. At that time, they thought it was a desert. So the debate raged on, and they had to come to a conclusion. And, the one thing that people were wondering is, why the heck would Napoleon want to make this deal? Well, here's the three reasons. One, this guy had, and I've used this term about him before, is that he had bigger fish to fry. I mean, this guy wanted to take over the entire world. That dream of his was starting to crumble a bit when he lost a small island off the coast of Florida known as Haiti to a slave revolt. Toussaint Louverture, pictured here, led a slave revolt and took over the island from the French. Well, the significance of that is that Napoleon, in his quest to take over the entire world, wanted to use Haiti as a base to attack America, to take over America. When he lost Haiti, that dream was foiled because he didn't have a base to attack from. And you can't attack the United States from France. It's too hard to do. You needed a base to bring everybody together and then plan an attack. The other reason, number two, is he needed money to fight Great Britain. Once again, Great Britain and France are at war. What else is new? They're constantly at war. And he felt like, $15 million would go a long way. And the other thing he hoped is that he would gain an ally in the United States, that the United States would be so thankful for the purchase of Louisiana that they would help him, and that by gaining all this land, America would become this power, and France and the United States could gang up on Great Britain. So there's some reasons why he wanted to do that. But nonetheless, I talked about the dilemma that he had. And, eventually he makes the right decision to purchase the land for $15 million. So with that signature, Jefferson, as you can see on this map, doubles the size of the United States with one single signature. So yeah, that's how we gain that territory. And one of the things that he wanted to do was explore in this area. And I'll talk a little bit about Sacagawea in a minute here. Probably need to talk more about Lewis and Clark and their expedition. I think a map back here, sorry to go back and forth, but I'm going to use this map to discuss the voyage of Lewis and Clark, as you can see right here. Jefferson, now that he's in possession of all this land, hired Lewis and Clark, and they had a small army of about 100 that were going to go up the Missouri River and explore this territory. They're hoping that the Missouri River goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It looks like it does here, but it does not. The Missouri River stops up here at the Rocky Mountains, and then you have to cross the Rocky Mountains, and then you have other rivers like the Columbia River and the Snake River that you could take to get to the Pacific Ocean, but you can't, get in a boat and go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's not doable. But Lewis and Clark left after being hired by Jefferson, left St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis is located at the junction of the Mississippi River and the Missouri River. That's why it's a bustling city then and today. A lot of cargo, a lot of things happen in St. Louis. Gateway to the West. That's why the big arch in St. Louis represents Gateway to the West and Lewis and Clark. So their job was to just explore and come back with all kinds of information about what they saw, and that's what they did. They literally drew maps as they sat in front of their keel boats that they took They took boats to go upriver, and you imagine how difficult it was for these boats to go upriver. Very difficult, because they're going against the current. And they had poles and ropes and you name it. And I'll talk more in class about their journey. And also I'll talk more about meeting up with the Mandan Indians here and meeting Sacagawea. Is They got up in this area in the wintertime. And if you know anything about geography, you know how very cold it is up in North Dakota during the wintertime. Well, they had to stop in October and didn't get going until April of the next year. So they spent some time with a friendly tribe named the Mandan, and that's where they met Sacagawea, who was going to be a guide for them. Interesting story about Sacagawea is she was kidnapped. She was a Shoshone Indian, and she lived at the base of the Rocky Mountains, and the Mandan Indians attacked and took her as and kidnapped her. And she lived her life with the Mandan over here in North Dakota, and she was a good guide for Lewis and Clark because, one, she was tough. Two, she spoke a lot of different Indian dialects, and they could communicate with her. She even knew French, as she was married to a French fur trapper. But she went with them, and then a crazy story is that she met up with her family when they got to the base of the Rocky Mountains, and that family helped them get through the Rocky Mountains and guided them all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But it's a very interesting story, that the journey of Lewis and Clark, and I will spend a little bit more time in class talking about it. And there's a timeline on here for you to look at about where they went, what they did, starting in May. It's a 3-year journey, and they finally were able to bring back all kinds of information for Jefferson about what is out there. This is a picture of the keel boats that they used. You could see a number of these keel boats. They had to pack all their supplies and be able to use that. And it was very difficult when they were going upriver, but on the way home, very easy as they were going downriver. But again, we'll talk more in class. The other guy given some props for exploring the southern part of the Louisiana Purchase would be Zebulon Pike. Pikes Peak in Colorado is named after him. Okay, let's talk a little bit about elections here. We're going to look at the election of 1804. After 4 years as president, Thomas Jefferson was enjoying some success, and also people liked him, and things were going well. So he wins in a landslide victory, 162-14 in the Electoral College. You could see that's a lot of Jefferson support there. So Jefferson will become a 2-term president. Now, I say he was very successful and very popular in his first term. Well, he was very unpopular in his second term for reasons that we're going to talk about now. The problems, he had many problems in his second term with both France and England. And yes, he had signed a treaty with the French, but things tended to go bad. Things did go bad after that. And with England, things have been going bad ever since the end of the Revolutionary War. And if you remember, there was no real closure to the Revolutionary War. The British thought they could continue to fight, and they got tricked at Yorktown. So there's this feeling like we should have won the war type thing. So Great Britain and France, long story short, are fighting each other again. Same old story, different year. Americans decided, hey, we're going to supply both sides. Americans have now opened factories. The Industrial Revolution is coming to America, and they're feeling pretty good about themselves. And they said, what could really help our factories is if we were able to sell goods to 2 warring countries. Warring countries need supplies because their factories are now producing things that they're using in battle, not necessarily clothing and things that people wanted. So Americans came to the aid of both France and Great Britain and brought them factory-made goods. And France and Great Britain were willing to pay a lot of money and were very thankful for this until they found out that the United States was trading with their enemy also. So it's a dangerous game Americans play. We've done it numerous times in history, and every single time we've done it, it's dragged us into wars. So you got to be careful about supplying goods to warring countries because the warring country's enemy, they don't like that. So it could drag you into battles. So both countries eventually tried to stop this with their international, what I call warnings. The British had one called the Orders of Council, and they said forbade any foreign ships from trading with France. The French came forward with their French decrees, and their French decree said, hey, any ship that's going to France or to England to trade with our enemy, fair game. We'll seize it, we'll sink it, we'll do whatever we want. So this really appalled Americans. We were very upset about that because we're strong believers in freedom of the sea, and we should be able to trade with whomever we want. I mean, we fought a Revolutionary War because one of the main reasons was our inability to be able to trade with whomever we want, right? That whole navigation acts and mercantilism thing that got us involved in the Revolutionary War. So now it's happening with the French and the English again. And they're sinking our ships and taking our cargo, and we don't like it. Well, the other thing that they were doing, and I mentioned this before, is they were kidnapping American sailors again. They were doing this after the Revolutionary War. It became commonplace for people who were in the British Navy to leave England, come to America because they know they could double their pay. Americans paid more. There's more money to be had. And this frustrated the British because their sailors were going AWOL. They were leaving. They were illegally leaving. And that practice of kidnapping Americans is called impressment. 6,000 Americans were impressed between 1808 and 1811. And Americans were furious. They tried to get this amended or changed with Jay's Treaty, but we know that Alexander Hamilton sabotaged that whole thing. So it continued for years after that. So between 1808 and 1811, 6,000 Americans, what they would do is they'd stop ships, board them, look for deserters from the British Navy. If they didn't find any, they'd just take Americans, and they'd force them to serve in the British Navy at gunpoint. Say, you're serving or you die. So Americans were forced to do that. I mean, I said it a couple chapters ago, but if one American sailor was kidnapped today, it'd be an international incident. The most classic example of blatant impressment was the Chesapeake Affair. And it happened on June 22nd, 1807, when an American ship called the Chesapeake was stopped by a British ship called the Leopard, and they demanded to board to look for deserters. The Chesapeake captain said no, so they broadsided him with a cannonball, put a hole in the side of the Chesapeake. The British then boarded the injured ship and took some Americans as prisoners and impressed them, and then sailed away and left them for dead. And they, basically this ship was going to sink. Here's the thing, though, is the Chesapeake wasn't that far off the coast of Virginia, which was a good thing in that they were able to limp back to the port there, back to Virginia, but a bad thing in that this happened so close to American soil. Well, what happened is Thomas Jefferson about freaked out. He said, "Are you kidding me? This happened right off the coast of Virginia?" And he reacted, and some would say maybe a little bit, to a certain extent, overreacted. And as a result of this, he passed what's called the Embargo Act of 1807. Now, let me just start out by saying this is going to make Thomas Jefferson one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. He is going to shut down every harbor in the United States, every single harbor. No ships could leave, none could go. You couldn't go fishing. You couldn't go to another state. He just shut down every harbor. His attitude was, I'll show the British. How dare they do this to our ship outside of in our own waters, basically. How dare they do this? So he said, we're going to use economic coercion. Economic coercion. Instead of going to war, he says, we're just going to stop giving them supplies. In essence, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas, by doing this, he overstated our value to them. Maybe that's not the right word to use, but overestimated our value to them. Basically, he's saying he thinks that we're more important to them. Our goods are more important to them than they actually are. They were able to survive without our stuff. But who it did hurt was us, right? By shutting every harbor in the United States. I mean, this is reminiscent of the Intolerable Acts, where the port of Boston was shut down. Not only was the port of Boston shut down, but every single harbor in America was shut down by the Embargo Act of 1807. Factories suffered. The merchant marines, those people are responsible for cargo, and they sail goods back and forth to different states and different countries. They suffered. Everybody, it seemed, was suffering in the United States because Jefferson said, I'm going to show them. So the Embargo Act made him very, very unpopular. In this political cartoon right here, it says, "Oh, this cursed, oh, grab me." Snapping turtle biting him in the rear end. Oh, grab me is embargo spelled backwards, by the way. Well, Jefferson kind of got the hint that this is probably not the best way to go. So he passed, then he repealed the Embargo Act shortly after and passed what's called the Non-Intercourse Act. In this case, intercourse means trade. Get your minds out of the gutter. This allowed the resumption of commercial intercourse, trade, except with Britain and France. So it basically reopened all harbors in the United States, but said you can't trade with Britain or France. And you know that Britain and France were the two most lucrative trade partners. Let me just say that. So Americans still weren't happy with this. That was the second part of it. I'll talk about the third part in a minute here. The election of 1808, Jefferson goes 2 terms and decides he's not going to go for a third, and he's going to honor the tradition of George Washington. James Madison is going to run. James Madison, who was the writer of the Constitution, and he was a former Secretary of State. He's going to go up against Charles Pinckney, the Federalist, and the Federalists are dying on the vine. They're still going to be able to run in elections, but they're dying on the vine. Just, you know, here understanding how much they're dying on the vine is that here is an example right here is that Jefferson was so unpopular. And under normal circumstances, they'll flip to the other party because even though Jefferson's not running, but anybody associated with Jefferson would have probably not got elected. But that's how bad the Federalists are. Their inability to relate to the common man, the Alien Sedition Acts, the Midnight Judges, it's just too much for Americans at the time. So James Madison's going to win this election. And he then amends the Non-Intercourse Act and says, okay, here's what we'll do. There are Americans that were upset because they weren't able to trade with France or Great Britain. And they passed Bacon's Bill number 2, which permitted trade with all countries, including Great Britain and France. But there was a stipulation in there that as enticement for Britain and France to get rid of their international warnings, it said that we will stop trading with if one country gets rid of their international warnings, then America would continue to trade with that country and stop trading with the other. So France comes forward immediately and says, okay, we repeal our French decrees. So America continued to trade with France, and they stopped trading with the British. And now we're going right down the road to war with Great Britain. So there was a loud group in Congress known as the War Hawks. And the War Hawks were Westerners, and they were led by the Speaker of the House, a very influential man in history. We'll talk about him a lot, Henry Clay. Henry Clay was from Kentucky, and he wanted war. Here's the reasons that they list for war, that Americans want war against Great Britain. Again, not France, against Great Britain. 1, 6,000 Americans impressed. Kidnapping 6,000 Americans, right? That'll get Americans to want to go to war. That's 1. The Orders of Council, which are the international warnings that, that they would sink our ships. British arming the Indians in the West, which prevented further expansion. Now, in a classic example of this is the Battle of Tippecanoe. the Battle of Fallen Timbers previously that we talked about in Ohio. Now the Battle of Tippecanoe happens in Indiana. Same type of situation. Future President William Henry Harrison, as a general at the time, goes in and tough battle, but defeats the Native Americans in Tecumseh. But again, what they find is that the Indians are firing weapons that are better than American weapons. They're using guns better than American guns. And they know that they're getting them this time from the British. Pontiac's rebellion, they were getting from the French. The Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Indians are getting their weapons from the British, and they're good weapons, and the Americans are frustrated. And think about this for a second. Henry Clay is from a western state of Kentucky. And what's preventing Kentucky from expanding even further west so they could grow more crops and make more money, the Indians are out there attacking them with British-made weapons. So in the mind of Henry Clay, he says, hey, if we could eliminate the Indians, we could move further west and plant more crops and make more money. So Henry Clay was a loud proponent of war against Great Britain. That's why he led this group in Congress called the Warhawks. And the Warhawks are Westerners. Here's another thing, is that it shows you the power of the West, the rising power of the West, that the Western states are going to be able to get us involved in a war because that's what they wanted. So anyways, the British Army and Indians of the West was a big part of why we're going to fight the War of 1812. The boundary disputes that we had between the United States and Canada, the Warhawks' desire for Canada. Now, why would Westerners want Canada? Well, it's about supply and demand. The more supply you have, right? If you have a big supply of land, the price is going to go down. If you have a lot of something, the price goes down. So if you add Canada to the amount of land that the United States government has, between the Western land and between land in Canada, the price for land would have to go down. So Henry Clay and his Warhawks say, okay, if we eliminate the Indians and then we expand further west and buy land, the land's going to be cheap because there's so much of it. That's what's cooking in their mind about why we should fight the War of 1812. And by golly, if they're not going to get us involved in the War of 1812, they're going to call it Mr. Madison's War. Most Americans don't want this war. I'm going to tell you, the British don't want this war. I mean, do you think the British want to fight the French in Europe and then turn and come and fight the Americans in the United States? I think not. It was the strangest war we've ever fought. War is going to be declared in 1812 by a vote of 79 to 49. 79 for, 49 against. And then the Senate, 1913. Yes, this is going to pass, but it's not going to be a rousing, support. It's not going to be rousing support for the war. So here's this statement that listen to the statement. A disunited America, because we're not united on this, had to fight both Old England and New England in the War of 1812, because New England and the harbors and the factories up there and the trade with Great Britain, they'd rather trade with them, not fight with them. Heck, at a certain point in this war, New England's going to threaten to secede from the Union because they hate the war so much. So this is not a popular deal in the United States. Very unpopular, very contentious time in American history is the time of the War of 1812. Strange war. We'll get into it in the next chapter.